Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from lunch. Welcome back to the second half of our first day, a day which is focusing on shaping a skills strategy in a globalized world. Now, I don't know about you, but I did pick up some positive messages from this morning's sessions, that there is work underway to try to ensure there is no perception that somehow vocational training, technical jobs are somehow a second choice, not as good as a classic education. A sense too that educational institutions were fine-tuning their training and cognizant, this is not just the educational institutions, but also companies and governments, that they need not only to provide better training for the skills of today, but the skills that are coming in the future, as difficult as that is to plan. Remember what His Excellency the Minister of Education said this morning. We don't really know what will be the skill set needed in 40 years' time, much less in 100 years' time. So these are huge challenges. And we heard, though, about those challenges with great and it's some uncomfortable clarity about just how big the gaps are. And I'm sure all of you know about them. The gaps between the broad range of educational institutions, the gaps between what the employers need and what the market is providing, the gaps between government policy and funding and planning. In our next session, which will be brought to us by the ILO, which is all about creating better work, a better working world, the ILO in Geneva will be here to discuss in greater detail this mismatch between the world of work and the world of education, jobs and skills. And I'd like to ask your moderator for this session all the way from Australia by way of Geneva, Paul Coleman, who is the Senior Skills and Employability Officer for the ILO in Geneva. Great word, employability. I'm sure we're all employable here. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and happy to be representing the International Labour Organisation at this inaugural WorldSkills International Conference as part of the competition program. As you've just heard, this conference is about the issue. This session is about the issue of jobs and skills mismatch, and what we want to try and do in this session is really unpack this idea of jobs and skills mismatch, because if you think about the idea of skills mismatch, you can really connect it to many of the major policy priorities that are evident in TVET and skills systems these days. So when you hear policymakers talk about the need to increase the amount of work-based learning, for example, and apprenticeships, that's partly about increasing the amount of practical skills and reducing skills mismatch as a result. If you think about the push towards giving greater autonomy to education and training institutions so they can form better relationships with local enterprises and industry, build practical partnerships, that again is often dressed in terms of addressing skills mismatch at the local level. If you think about the introduction of competency-based training and outcomes-based qualification frameworks, very much focused on improving the links between qualifications and curriculum and the needs of particular occupations and enterprises. Again, using the language of skills mismatch to justify a certain policy agenda. Strengthening labour market information systems, increasing the role of social partners in social dialogue around skills and training matters, again is positioned in relation to this overarching challenge of addressing skills mismatch. Even supporting competitions, as we are here today, is seen to be a way of addressing the social profile of skills and therefore making TVET more attractive, and in doing so improving the supply of skills and narrowing the gap between the supply and demand for skills. And the list goes on. Skills mismatch is an issue that is often articulated by policymakers, employers and workers' organisations as a pressing challenge for today's education and training systems. But what we want to try and do in this session is really to problematise that idea and to get a better handle on what exactly does skills mismatch mean, how does it manifest itself, what does it look like, and what's the labour market impact of skills mismatch. The ILO has been working in the area of skills and employability for nearly 100 years. The ILO centenary is in 1919. The ILO currently has 187 member states, and we're the only tripartite organisation of the United Nations. So that means if your country is represented at the ILO, you have a representative of government, of workers and employers discussing the issues related to the world of work. And skills is certainly an important element of that dialogue and the ongoing work that the ILO does. We currently have over 600 technical assistance projects in more than 100 countries, partnering with more than 120 development partners. And across that range of activities, skills development is a key issue. And so those sorts of policy reforms that I spoke about earlier are also central to the technical assistance and the technical cooperation projects that we deliver. So skills mismatch is an issue of importance to the ILO, and one that's actually led us to do some interesting research over the last 12 months through a new initiative on jobs and skills mismatch, particularly looking at the issue in low and middle income countries. So without further ado, to start the discussion, I want to show a brief video. The video is from our Director General, Mr. Guy Ryder, who is unfortunately not able to join us today, but has sent this message with a few key points to start the discussion. Thank you.
Honourable Ministers, delegates, ladies and gentlemen attending the WorldSkills Conference 2017. I want to thank the Government of the United Arab Emirates and the WorldSkills International for organising this conference and for inviting me to be part of the event. The agenda of the 2017 WorldSkills Conference includes issues that are crucial for the development of skills strategies in our increasingly globalised and digital world, and I welcome the fact that jobs and the skills mismatch are high on that agenda. There is no doubt that we live in challenging times. Youth unemployment remains at alarmingly high levels, and employment growth has yet to return to the levels that we had before the global financial crisis. Ongoing debates surrounding digitalisation and the future of work pose questions that strike at the heart of our understanding of how work will evolve and what place it will have in our lives in the future. And these same questions also pose challenges to education and training systems, which are faced with the very difficult task of responding to changes in the labour market and meeting the demands of employers and society more broadly. Now, in this context, the combination of high and persistent levels of unemployment on the one hand, coupled with numerous job vacancies on the other, is often used to explain the lack of employment growth, and in many cases as criticism of the effectiveness of education and training. However, the idea that skills mismatch can be fixed by more relevant and demand-driven training alone only tells part of the story, and isn't the sole reason why employers can't fill their job vacancies. Low-quality education and training is one factor, but it can also be the result of demographic change, rapid technological development, new sources of job creation and newly created forms of work, and also substandard public employment services and labour market information systems. And while the causes of skills mismatch might be open to debate, I think that one thing we can all agree on is that the consequences can only be detrimental for individuals, for productivity and competitiveness, and ultimately for economic growth in general. And because of this, the topic of skills mismatch is a priority for the ILO's tripartite constituents. Our work in this area is supported, guided, and informed by the government, employer and worker organisations of our member countries. And over the last 12 to 18 months, the ILO has undertaken new research and developed new knowledge products to provide improved support to our constituents with regard to the different types of skills mismatch, their impact on the labour market, and the different possible policy responses to reduce and to mitigate their consequences. And we will do more. The technical session in which you are about to participate forms part of a global programme and will be followed by other regional presentations in Asia and in Latin America later this year. And it's important for the ILO to continue to undertake serious and considered study of the exact nature of skills mismatch and its impact on the labour market. Effective policy responses depend on having the right data and the right analysis. We need to be asking more critical and targeted questions. What type of skills mismatch are we really trying to address? Is it the high levels of over-education caused by the expansion of higher education in some countries? Or is it the lack of specific technical skills amongst existing workers in enterprises? These are examples of very different phenomena and require different policy responses. And we must all keep in mind that the pace of change in the world of work today means it is an absolute priority to deliver systems for lifelong learning. However perfectly a skill set acquired at the beginning of a career may match labour market needs, we can be certain that they will not match them midway through or by the end of a working life. So let me close by wishing you all a thought-provoking and fruitful session, and I look forward to hearing the results of your discussions. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a few concepts there, I guess, that I just want to flag before handing over to Seamus, who's going to give us the sort of more technical presentation, and that really is that there are different forms of skills mismatch. So when you talk about skills mismatch, you actually need to be clear about what type of skills mismatch you're talking about, and that they come about as a result of different factors. There are different drivers of these different forms of skills mismatch. And as such, the policy responses need to be nuanced, so they have to be fit for purpose. Without stealing any more of Seamus's thunder, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's Professor Seamus McGuinness. He's a research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. Prior to joining ESRI, Seamus held posts at Queen's University Belfast, Northern Ireland Economic Research Centre and the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research. He's adjunct professor in the Department of Economics at Trinity College Dublin and an IZA research fellow. He's a designated expert on the Irish labour market in the European Commission's Employment and Policy Observatory and has published extensively on topics related to skills and educational mismatch. So, Seamus, over to you, mate.
Thanks, Paul. So I'll just wait for my presentation to appear. So, as Paul said, the concept of skill mismatch is a complex one. It's a term that really incorporates a number of different potential measures of skill mismatch, which manifest themselves differently in terms of individuals and firms and have very different policy responses. This morning, most of the talk when we were hearing about skill mismatches was very much focused on skill shortages and skill gaps within firms. However, that's only one form of skill mismatch. So what I want to talk about today is actually what are the different types of skill mismatch that exist? Why should we be worried about them? How do they manifest themselves? What are the impacts? And then ask the question, is policy actually focused in the right direction in terms of the evidence base? So we can categorize skill mismatches into four different areas, really. This is where they occur when we see them in the policy and the academic literature. The most common form of skill mismatch in terms of the academic literature is that of vertical skill mismatches. This is usually measured from the perception of the worker who says, well, I have too much education or too much skills or too little education or too little skills relative to the requirements of my job. For example, an overeducated worker would be a worker who has a degree but believes that their job only requires a high school diploma. An undereducated worker is someone who has a high school diploma but says, actually, my job really needs a degree. An overskilled worker is someone who says, I have too many skills and abilities over and above what this job requires. And an underskilled worker is someone who says, I don't have the skills and abilities to do that job. And these concepts are generally measured from the perception of the worker. Then we have skill gaps and skill shortages, and we heard something of those today. And these are measured from the perspective of the firm typically, where a skill gap is where the employer says, my workers do not have the requisite skills necessary to do the job that I require them to do. And a skill shortage is said, well, I have unfilled vacancies because of a lack of qualified candidates. Then there's a notion of horizontal mismatch, where the person is matched in terms of their level of education, but mismatched in terms of field of study. So you have an engineer, a graduate engineer working in a graduate job, but as a librarian. And then we have the notion of skill obsolescence. People that were previously matched in terms of skills, but then have subsequently become mismatched because of, say, technological change. So these are the concepts, and they're very, very different concepts. And although they look similar, they're actually very poorly correlated. Only 40% of individuals, when we measure them in the same data set, who are overeducated, are also overskilled. There's a poor correlation between skill gaps and underskilling. So, as Paul was saying, the evidence suggests that these different types of skill mismatches present themselves in different ways and will require different policy responses. But we should be worried about them all, because in theory, each of these various forms of skill mismatch has the potential to have very serious implications for the firms, individuals, and the economy more generally. If we think of skill shortages and skill gaps, well, when they exist, they're likely to raise the labour costs of firms, lower productivity and firm-level growth and macroeconomic growth potentially. When we see vertical mismatch, we're saying, well, people are unable to work in jobs to their full potential. Okay, they're not earning their marginal product, and as a consequence of that, they're likely to suffer wage penalties, productivity at the individual level will be lower, and at the macroeconomic level will be lower. Skill obsolescence, again, this is a problem. If we believe this fourth industrial revolution is at our door, then we may see people's skills being eroded by technological change and skill obsolescence becoming a real problem. Horizontal mismatch also implies that there is a loss of resources at the individual level that could also show itself at the macroeconomic level. So what we sought to do in this study was actually to say, what is the evidence for these various forms of mismatch? Okay, how much do we know about them in terms of their incidence and their impacts? We reviewed the academic and the policy literature for the last 10 years, and what you can see first and foremost is that there's a lot of research and documentation out there in terms of forms of vertical mismatch. But in terms of skill shortages and skill gaps, which dominated the discussion this morning, there's actually very little research. And the reason for that is actually there's very poor data in this area. For overeducation, we don't actually need to ask people whether or not they're overeducated. We can actually estimate that. So that's easy to do, and that's why there's a lot of studies in that area. But for studies of overskilling, our skill gaps and skill shortages, we need to be asking questions of either the firms or the individual workers. And there's a real dearth of evidence there. Basically, what we see is that if the data exists, the evidence exists. We don't see the evidence in areas where there's a high level of problem in terms of skill mismatch. So if you look at that chart, on the horizontal axis, we have the number of estimates of skill mismatch, and on the vertical axis, the average incidence of skill mismatch. So we see that the number of estimates are higher for Belgium, Spain, the UK, and Germany, where over-education isn't really that high. It's just that they've got good data. So there is a real problem in terms of the evidence base out there for some forms of skill mismatch that we know very little about. So based on our studies and our review of the study, what did we find? What were the facts that emerged? Well, from 241 estimates from 37 countries, the average incidence of over-education is 25%. So just think about that a moment. On average, and this data comes from mostly developed countries, 1 in 4 workers believes that they are overeducated. And overeducation incurs a general pay penalty of around 14% in those individuals. So a graduate in a non-graduate job will earn 14% less than the graduate in the graduate job. So if we think about that level of lost productivity and we add it up across the economy, that's quite a serious problem. In terms of undereducation, the incidence is lower. Around 16% of workers believe themselves to be undereducated. We don't see much evidence of a wage effect there. Overskilling, the incidence is 21%. Again, there's a strong evidence of surplus human capital measured in this way, but the pay penalty is much lower than for overeducation at around 7.5%. Underskilling, again, 25% of workers are saying they don't have the skills to do the job that they would require, but we don't see much of an effect on earnings. In terms of horizontal mismatch, this is mostly a graduate concept, and what it's telling us is around 40% of graduates are working in areas outside their field of study. There's no wage impacts, but that's an important factor that I'll come back to later. In terms of the concept that we were talking about this morning, skill shortages, there's actually very few studies, and it's very hard to get a single average estimate because the question that's asked differs from studies to study. But one study that is quoted quite a bit is a 2010 Eurobarometer survey that says 47% of firms recruiting higher education graduates reported recruitment difficulties, and that's a scary number. But actually, CETIFOP unpacked that figure somewhat, and they found that actually the vast majority of those recruitment difficulties were due to the firms offering an inadequate wage or ineffective HRM policies. Only 1/10 of those recruitment difficulties related solely to a skill shortage. And there is virtually no evidence out there linking skill shortages at the level of the firm to firm level productivity. There's no evidence, very little evidence that actually says skill shortages harm firm level productivity. In terms of skill gaps, again, there's very little evidence relating to either the incidence or the impacts of that. However, Peter Capelli, in a very influential 2014 NBER paper, has stated and asserted from his analysis that there's no consistent evidence that skill shortages or skill gaps are a significant problem within the US labour market. In terms of skill obsolescence, again, we don't have much evidence of that. So our skill mismatches are just a problem for developed economies. The data that I showed you that reviewed all of those estimates more or less came exclusively from developed economies. We know very little about the situation in low and middle income countries, but as Paul has said, the ILO has commissioned a series of research which I and others have been involved in, and a picture is now starting to emerge. And we're just about to publish 3 very substantial studies in the area. We now have estimates of mismatch, skill mismatch, mostly over-education for about 50 low and middle income countries. And we find that over-education and under-education are again significant features of developing labour markets. Relative to developed labour markets, under-education is much more of a problem. But where we do see over-education in low and middle income countries, again we see large pay penalties there, which again indicates lost productivity. And those pay penalties are higher than what we see in developed economies. The one thing that I will add is that in terms of the drivers of over-education and under-education in low and middle income countries, it's quite different from what we believe is the situation in developed economies, that There, the problem is about high levels of informality in the labour market, low levels of educational attainment, and poor job quality. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. So that's the evidence base. So the next question is, where is policy focused? Well, there seems to be a big misalignment between the focus of policy and the actual evidence base, as I've just discussed. To analyse where policy is at, we looked at the 2016 country-specific recommendations issued by the Council of the European Union and the 2016 National Reform Programme publication. So this is basically where the European Commission tells the Member States this is where your policy should be focused in terms of the areas of skill mismatch. Basically, any time that skill mismatch is referred to specifically, it is referred to in the form of skill shortages. In some of the documents, skill mismatch is just referred to as that. They don't define actually what form of skill mismatch they're talking about, but when we look at the policy responses, it's quite clear they're talking again about skill shortages. In terms of the new skill agenda for Europe, a central figure again emerges around this: 40% of European employers having difficulty finding people with the right skills they need to grow and innovate. Again, I would contest that that's a very dubious figure, that lots of those skill shortages will actually be apparent skill shortages. Again, the NSA fact sheet focuses really at eradicating mismatches at a sectoral level. And I'll not bore you anymore with the detail, other than to say no other form of mismatch, skill mismatch, was mentioned in any of those CSRs other than skill shortages and, to some extent, skill gaps. There was no mention of overeducation or surplus human capital in any shape or form. So this is the situation where we are at. We have this term skill mismatch, which is very broad and can refer to a number of concepts relating to vertical mismatch, horizontal mismatch, skill gaps, skill shortages, skill obsolescence. We have lots of evidence in relation to the cost of having surplus human capital, but very little evidence with respect to skill shortages and skill gaps. But we do know where surplus human capital is present, and it's present to a very high extent. Individuals are constrained in terms of their earnings. But despite this, the policy focus is almost exclusively on the area for which the evidence base is thinnest: skill shortages and skill gaps. Well, why is this disconnect, and why does it exist? Well, there are political challenges for any government or the European Commission initiating any policies that seem to question the long-held assumption that continually expanding education is always a good thing. So it's politically difficult. It's also practically difficult to think about ways in which policies can encourage firms to better utilise their workers. There may be this view also amongst policymakers that if you tackle one form of mismatch, you'll automatically impact all of the rest of them. We know that's not the truth, and that can't happen because the various forms of skill mismatch, even though they look alike, are purely correlated. They affect different people in different ways, and therefore, we would argue they require separate and bespoke policy responses. I think there's also a view that among policymakers that, well, actually, these are just temporary phenomena. Of course, the markets work. Markets are always clear. You look at these guys in 2 or 3 years, they'll be matched. Actually, they're not. This is a non-transitory phenomenon. If you get stuck in a mismatched state, particularly if it's over-education or over-skilling, in 5 years' time, there's a very high probability that 50 to 60% of the individuals will still be mismatched. So the shock news is that markets sometimes don't always clear, and policy intervention is required. And then we have, obviously, the strength of the employers' lobby. I said no more about that. You're all sitting in front of me. So the way forward, there needs to be a more transparent and consistent approach taken in terms of where policy is focused. But policy can't continue to ignore the fact that 1 in 4 workers are operating across the developed and the developing world at a level below their potential, and are suffering wage penalties, and productivity is being lost at an aggregate level because of it. Now, we're not saying that we should ignore the problems of skill shortages and skill gaps. Of course, policy should continue to try and continually improve welfare by reducing skill shortages and skill gaps. But policy can also try and improve the welfare of individuals in society by removing the constraints on individuals through over-education and over-skilling. And also, I think that the concept of skill mismatch itself blurs the debate too much. Policy needs to be data-focused. We need more data. identifying what is the form of skill mismatch that is present in particular labour markets, and policies need to be specifically designed for those purposes. It's not the case that we can't do anything about skills mismatch, and a lot of evidence is starting to come, particularly from the academic literature, that some policies will improve the situation. Improving the match between the composition of educational supply with the demands of employers is one thing. Obviously, we've heard that this morning. But it's not good enough having good labour market intelligence. You need institutions that actually ensure that the supply side, the universities and colleges actually react to changes in labour market demand. In Ireland, we have very good labour market intelligence, but we have a very static supply system because we don't have the institutions in place, such as whether it be sectoral skills councils or whatever, to ensure that changes in demand are being fed through to the supply side. But saying that, it's also a very difficult policy area because there are industrial relations issues, it takes time to effect change, but it is one area where policy certainly needs to do more. There's also evidence to suggest that increasing the vocational content of all post-compulsory courses will reduce the level of mismatch. Basically, the argument seems to suggest there should be placements in most courses and certainly in all degree courses, irrespective of the subject area. There's a problem in terms of reducing information gaps between employers and workers, so the use of better career services and matching services also has been shown to be important. And then we have the role of employers. What are the policies through which employers can change their work practice to ensure that they can better enhance the skills and abilities of their workers? Are there more flexible ways that employers can operate in order to reduce the impacts of particularly surplus human capital like over-education and over-skilling? In terms of the policy drivers for low and middle income countries, while all of those things that I've just mentioned will have some effect, the real area of movement needs to be about improving rates of formal employment, improving rates of educational attainment at both the intermediate and basic levels, and also stimulating GDP per capita growth. Those seem to be the main areas that will reduce the level of mismatch in low and middle income countries. So to sum up, this is a complex area. To sum up, we've been hearing a lot about skill shortages and the impact of skill shortages this morning. What I will say is the evidence base needs to improve in that area if it is to remain the focus of policy. Policy cannot continue also to ignore the very strong evidence that there are very large proportions of workers with surplus skills and they are suffering wage penalties, and therefore there's a productivity loss to the economy from that form of mismatch also. Basically, we need to be having a more focused, evidence-based policy debate around the issue of skill mismatches than we are currently having.
Thank you very, very much. I think not surprisingly, coming from a specialized agency like the ILO, that was a very, very useful breakdown of what has been a thread through all of our discussions today, the mismatch between jobs and skills, starting with what we heard from Paul, then the video from the Director General, and then Seamus's very interesting, very detailed elaboration of this concept. I mean, we heard from Guy Ryder that you don't necessarily assume that the mismatch is all about education, all about the TVET. Of course, it's important, but he says, be more detailed. Look at it. Is it a question of the labour market? Is it a question of democratic change? Maybe it's linked to technological disruption. Very important in policy terms to know exactly what is causing the mismatch. And then head straight to Seamus's presentation, which he says, how useful is this concept of a skills match, whether it's overemployed, underemployed, overskilled, underskilled? What about the disconnect between policy and evidence? I think this is really very useful, especially for those, and many of you will either be in companies or educational institutions or governments who want to try to close that gap. Disappointing, of course, to see, we've had that phrase earlier today with the short-termism, that the government, in the face of compelling evidence about this mismatch and disconnect, that governments aren't doing enough about it, employers don't want to do enough about it, because, of course, it costs money, costs time, takes a lot of thinking. So thank you very, very much to the ILO for bringing us a little bit further in terms of really grappling with this issue. But we're not going to finish yet because we have another panel, and I'm going to be joined now by Olga Stretska-Ilina, who's another senior skills and employability specialist. If you're worried about losing your job, we've got employability specialists here to kind of help you along from the ILO. Olga's going to take it over.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to do the routines here. I would like to introduce the panel. We have a very distinguished panel, which is of course tripartite, because we are the International Labour Organization. We're a tripartite organization by the definition. So please join me. Ms. Mani Nazreen, she represents Business Unity South Africa. Then Ms. Anna Bychowska from the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. Sunita Sanghi from Niti Aayog, India. NITI is a National Institute for Transforming India. It's a government policy think tank. And we have a privilege of having Seamus with us, with all the technical knowledge he brings to the discussion. So, as you heard, we can hardly speak about skills mismatch as a kind of homogeneous concept. And in fact, it's quite misleading to speak about mismatch as anything unique. And therefore, also taking policy measures, also conceptualizing policy measures with an approach that there is such thing as skills mismatch could be quite misleading. At the same time, we know that there are really severe negative consequences from mismatch on workers' productivity, on competitiveness of enterprises, with potential negative effects also on economies. But several different types of mismatch have different consequences as well. So over-education and under-education, over-skilling and under-skilling, skills gaps, skills shortages will not have the same type of consequences on the labor market for individuals, but also for companies and for economies. Also, what is important is that skills mismatch is not a neutral concept. It doesn't sit in isolation. It actually finds itself in very different situations of different income level economies, low income, middle income, high income. And we know also that higher levels of informality, poor working conditions also have implications on skills mismatch. So I think this all we have to take into account, as well as we have to take into account the perspectives of our tripartite constituents who joined us in this panel. And my first question will be really to ask each of you basically the same question, but from the perspective of the organization you represent. And I will start from Sunita. So Sunita, you represent government, and it's a policy think tank. So given all this information you heard from the presentation from Seamus, do you think skills mismatch is really something significant we have to deal with? And then if yes, then what would be the most important policy issue to deal with skills mismatch? Or maybe in other words also, which type of skills mismatch is the most significant specifically in India?
Thank you, Olga. I think Professor, the keynote speaker, has already talked about the various kind of skill mismatches that exist. And as a policy planner, I feel, yes, skill mismatch is really a cause of concern. It's not only that it's for the developing economies, but for the developed economies also. From the Indian perspective, I'll be talking about from the Indian perspective, we are said to be enjoying the demographic advantage. But then at the same time, we also have a problem where we have a huge informal economy. Close to 93% of Indian population is working in the informal sector. There are three kinds of mismatches that are very relevant for India, which are visible in India. One mismatch that we have is overqualification. Here there are people who have the qualification, but they're not getting the right kind of a job, which means the jobs are not available, people are available. And this paradoxical situation causes a problem of a huge skill mismatch. We also have a mismatch, which is a market perverse incentive that market is giving. But when I say market is giving a perverse incentive, people are there with qualification, let's say with the qualification of civil engineer, electrical engineer, doctors, but they're not willing to do that job. What they're doing is they're either joining the administrative service and they're not using those particular skills in the jobs that they're going to do. So this is the market incentive that is there. The third kind is that there is a genuine skill lack, that people are not there. People are actually not there because there's a skill shortage. It may be either because we have a very poor level of education. There are close to 80% of people in country who are just having secondary level of education. Given the fact that you have a low level of education, that creates a problem. It creates a problem because they are not willing to, they cannot wait. They have to enter the labor market, and they enter the labor market at whatever level that they are joining. The government of India has announced a huge mission, which is a national skill development mission, and we are trying to address most of the challenges that in the skill space in terms of the skill mismatch that we are facing. We have put in place what we call a labor market information system. This is one policy promise that we have taken, which is trying to bring on board the three critical partners, be it a training institutions or the training provider, or it is the government, it's the academia, and also the industry and the prospective trainee who are coming. This is the labor market information system is trying to provide the information about the new jobs that are going to be there, so that the training institution can change their training curriculum according to the requirement. We have also put in place what we call a national skill qualification framework, because as somebody was saying in the morning panel, that skill is something, which is not only in India but in the Asian economies, it's looked down upon, because people think that if you're going for the vocational education, you are not good, so you are taking it as a last resort. To make it very aspirational, the national skill qualification framework, which is providing a mobility pathways to people who are joining the vocational education, this is a policy that we have taken on board. Then to involve the industry, there are sector skill councils, which is a way to involve the industry, so that the course curriculum that we are taking on board is actually reflecting the needs of the industry. We are also trying to make, the most important thing that is trying to make is to make education universal, the secondary education at least universalized, because having achieved primary education universalization, we are now universalizing the secondary education. And the vocational education is inbuilt into it, so that when a student comes out of the educational institution, he knows what is there in the world of work. The final point that I would like to say is that there is a huge focus on the apprenticeship training. The apprenticeship, because if a student, he learns from the factory, he works on the floor of the factory, he knows. And there are efforts by the government of India to incentivize the industry. They're providing stipend to the industry, the support of a stipend to the industry, so that industry can come forward and take apprentices. Given the fact that we have a huge micro, small and medium enterprise industry, we are taking a clustering approach. In a cluster, we collect the people, and then we are moving forward to provide the apprenticeship training. So these are the policy initiatives that we are taking to address the issue of skill mismatch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunita. This is a very interesting perspective of a country with 90% of economy being informal, middle-income country with huge potential, but also quite big challenges. And we can hear from Sunita that yes, skills mismatch is a real problem, because there is a genuine lack of skilled people as well, but also there is a problem of skills utilization. And of course, the challenge of bringing industry more into the story of provision of skills, so that skills provided are relevant to the needs of the labor market, is a big challenge and is a big, huge policy priority as well. So, and I think this is actually a very good link also to Anna. So from the perspective of trade unions, do you find the whole discussion about skills mismatch relevant, or maybe you think that the concept is a bit overblown? And if not, then what would be the highest priority on the agenda in terms of policy making to combat skills mismatch?
No, I think from a trade union perspective, which is a workers' perspective, because this is who we represent, it is not so much about the different types of skills mismatches. It is about how can we overcome those types in order to have people in quality jobs? And I think Guy said it very well in his video already, that there are other underlying factors that contribute to skills mismatches and to labor market failures as such at large. So we need to see it from a broader perspective, and not only education and training systems are therefore to blame and should not only be the focus when addressing skills mismatches as such. So from our perspective, we should take a labor market transition lens. In doing so, we need to precisely involve all actors that are concerned in a tripartite environment and strategy. And by doing that, we need to, from our perspective, we need to look first at access. Can workers really profit from training? Are there opportunities for them? Are employers truly investing in work-based learning? Are there systems in your countries for paid educational leave? Is information enough provided to workers that they can actually take up certain training schemes that are provided through public financing, for instance? Some workers just don't know that. And if you operate in systems where trade unions are not a recognized institutionalized actor, which sometimes unfortunately is the case, there are no representatives and no intermediary link between workers and the public system to inform them of the different opportunities that they might have. So that's one, that's providing access. How can we facilitate that? Then in terms of quality, there are systems where you have dual VAT systems that most of you know about, where you have both technical training that is taking place at the workplace and school-based training in public institution systems. Here, the ones that are working very well are those where you have social partners' involvement. So both trade unions and employers are involved in the design of the programs itself, on the content. They are both involved when it comes to designing the financing schemes and then also in the oversight. So to see how can we improve those systems, what is needed in terms, for example, when it comes to digitalization, technological change, and all of these things. And then I completely agree with what has already been said. We need more tailored programs because, for instance, with demographic change, you need programs that are adaptable to different age groups. There is a difference between youth and non-standard forms of work that we just need to bring out of it, and we need more tailored, longer programs for them. But then we might need to look into adult training programs that might take shape in rather short courses, in courses at the workplace, with training, public training accounts like the one that was introduced in France this year, where you can accumulate rights to training through working hours that you have performed. So it can all be channeled into more, let's say not sophisticated, but more coordinated systems that also provide a greater accountability in a sense and help workers navigate through them. And you have to ask ultimately, and this is my last point for now, you have to ask workers what they need as well. Because sometimes workers feel that they underperform because they're not challenged enough at their job, because they would like to actually learn a new software skill or a new language or whatever it is that they might need for their job, but they're just not given the opportunity because some employers, unfortunately, are misinterpreting their budget goals by taking a low road strategy when it comes to investing into training and into their workforce. And I think in terms of productivity, and we should all be interested in higher productivity levels in our respective countries, we need to encourage employers, and that's what we do as trade unions, to invest more in training, but also from a government point of view, to give them incentives, to give them tax reliefs and certain subsidies. And the same goes for families who need allowances to bring their children into quality education systems as well.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I listened very carefully to you, and what I found a little bit striking, really, that when we speak about demand side and the importance of understanding how demand is developing, and then therefore also how we have to shape skills provision. Really, the voices of workers are not really considered very frequently. It's actually quite rare that there is a survey that also involves workers. This is very much true. And in fact, yes, indeed, more opportunities, more training provision, and also incentives, some kind of innovative solutions that can help bringing workers into more lifelong learning opportunities. And with this, I'll go to money. So another heavily populated country, middle income, with big challenges, South Africa. So from the point of view of employers, businesses, what do you think about the concept and where the priorities are in terms of policies?
So, Olga, I think as you've correctly stated, highly complex topic. But South Africa is also a highly complex country, many first world institutions, but huge social inequality that still exists. And that complicates the whole issue of jobs and skills mismatch. Much of Seamus's research around developing countries resonate with the South African experience. We have huge levels of inequality, large wage differentials. We're sitting currently with an official unemployment rate of 27%. And of that, youth unemployment is 54%. But at the same time, we have this contradiction where employers have extended lengths of time to find the right skills. So there's certainly that complication of needing the right skills for the job, having a portion of the population that is educated and trained, but we just can't get the right people into the right job. Now, South Africa has a national qualifications framework. Sunita mentioned India has just started one. We've had one now for nearly 20 years. We have a very formalized system of education and training. And as employers, we're starting to ask the question, could that also be limiting opportunities into the labor market? We have this obsession with degrees. I think just about every panel since the morning has spoken about the focus on higher education as opposed to TVET. We've just come through a 6-month process as business, labor, and government trying to formalize our next national skills development plan, looking to the future to at least 2030. But part of the challenge is some inflexibility in that plan, where we again only focus on the funding of accredited training. And we're saying as employers, we don't necessarily have the luxury of spending 2 years to develop new curricula as technology changes, for example. We need to be able to train people quickly. We need an agile workforce. We need a flexible workforce. We need transferable skills. We can't be locked into training individuals for 2 years, and by the time they come out, those skills are no longer relevant to the needs of the labor market. So we're having that slight challenge at the moment. And I wonder, I think that's probably a challenge many employer bodies are facing around the world, not just in South Africa. I think a big issue is the social partners sitting down and talking to one another. I think we need to take into account the combination of the decent work agenda, but also a flexible work agenda. I'm aware of very heated discussions at the World Employment Conference 2 weeks ago, where issues such as Uber, Airbnb caused highly contentious discussions, and the idea that that may not be a moral form of work. So, for example, I think the discussion went somewhere along the lines of, are Uber drivers workers or contractors? And if we want to protect the rights of workers, then as consumers, we must use our conscience and not use Uber. That's too simplistic an argument. I think we must acknowledge that the world of work is changing. The forms of work are changing. Again, we've heard speakers talk about the multiple forms of work future generations are going to have, sometimes at the same time. I, for one, have 3 different jobs at the same time. So I'm probably 1 foot into the future. It's not easy to manage. But I think as employers, we also need to be open to that. We need to take into account flexibility. We can't be tied into very structured labor regulations. And I'm not saying that labor regulations are not important, but the future of the work contract may need to change. We may need to have these very fluid, flexible skills where we bring people in as and when we need them. I think, again, we're seeing the stats, and we've heard it again, 65% of children completing schools in the next 5 to 10 years will be in jobs that don't exist. So there is going to be a skills mismatch. The issue of gender parity, we've had it again. more women need to come into the workplace, but the workplace must be flexible to accommodate families that are, the role and structure of families are changing. And how do we do that? So I think as employers, they're huge challenges for us. From a policy perspective, particularly in South Africa, our appeal to government has been for policy coherence. And Seamus mentioned, we tend to look at policies, but in isolation to one another, and there are unintended consequences on other policies. So policy certainty, policy coherence, and being open to a far more flexible future, I think.
Thank you very much, Moni. I actually have a follow-up question for you, if I may. You actually touched upon a very important issue about the changing world of work, and also the changing phenomenon of a contract, and who actually a worker or a contracted worker is. And then it just not happened so that workers, up to a certain period in history, actually relied on employers in the training provision, very much so. And then somehow it happened that this transferred on the shoulders of governments and became an expectation from governments that they train workers. So now, especially with the whole gig economy discussion and changing work organization as such, all these people who are in Uber, or those ones who are doing, I don't know, accountancy or translations, who are basically hired and fired in the next 5 minutes after provision of their jobs. Do you think this is something we can deal with, and how can employers still be on board in the training provision more broadly as well?
No, I think that's a critical point. I think at no point can we absolve employers of the responsibility to train. We cannot talk about training to the needs of the workplace and leave it to the hands of government, because governments are not ahead of the trend. They're not ahead of the curve. Employers are, or we should be. So in South Africa in particular, we have a skills development levy, very similar to what the Honourable Minister from the United Kingdom mentioned this morning. That policy has been in place since 2000, so we're 17 years into it, and it's a substantial amount. We collect almost $1 billion a year, if not more, from employers based on a payroll threshold, and the intention is that money is invested back into training, both for workers in the workplace. So my colleague Raymond Patel this morning spoke about every workplace must be a training place. It comes out of this National Skills Development Levy policy. So the money is reinvested into the workplace, upskilling of current employees, but also to look at new entrants into the market and strengthening the pipeline. So working with TVET colleges, working with universities, working around new curricula, innovative training models. And only we as employers can do that, I think. We need government and we need trade unions as partners. I think we mustn't forget that particularly in South Africa, we work with the Tripartite Alliance, so we must bring our social partners on board, but it cannot be only up to government. I think for a long time we've relied on...
% of jobs on average don't require advanced literacy skills, 60% don't require advanced numeracy skills, and around 70% don't require advanced ICT skills. If I define a highly skilled job as a job that has high literacy, high numeracy, and high ICT skills, the rate is around between 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 jobs across the EU. So I don't see in the data this technological change that everyone is talking about. What I do see is that there are pockets of very rapid change, such as Uber, etc., that gather a lot of attention and a lot of discussion. But when we look at it, they're actually minute parts of the labour market. So I don't want to sound totally cynical in everything that I say today, but I'm not sure that I buy the argument, basically, because when we looked at the data, the job quality just doesn't seem to be moving in the direction that the argument seems to suggest that it is. The other sort of preconception that was debunked by the research is the notion that over-education is actually being driven up over time by rising levels of educational expansion. That actually isn't happening. It is true that educational provision is expanding quite rapidly through the 90s and the noughties and onwards in both developed and developing economies. But in fact, over-education has remained stable over that period and declined in lots of countries. So it's not a simple story of a poor interaction between supply and demand. It's a very complex situation. Something is happening in terms of technological change that is absorbing the increased output of the education system to some extent, but not to the degree that it actually is reducing or imposing changes in the rate of mismatch. So it's a very complex story. I don't buy the argument that technological change is going to change things as rapidly. If we look back in history, and Capelli makes this argument, from the Industrial Revolution, we've seen the arguments that robots or technology is going to take over the world and replace jobs. I'm not sure that this is any different, this phase of the story, than past episodes or chapters.
Thank you, Seamus. I actually tend to agree with you because we had this story before, and they're coming in waves.
Yeah.
So now I go back to my left side, and Mani, again with you. So you heard in the initial presentation from Seamus that in fact perhaps skills mismatch doesn't have that harsh implications on businesses as they are expected. And also there was something on the data which were coming from CDFOP saying that in fact if you clean the data from attractiveness of jobs as such, whether the salaries which are offered are competitive enough, then you actually find that genuine mismatch is not that frequent, especially when it comes to skills shortages. What do you think about that from the business perspective?
So, Olga, I think to some extent there's validity in the data, and I, for one, won't contradict Professor Capelli. but I think, again, it is just such a complex question. And I think perhaps we've seen the different terminologies around it, and we tend to lump it as skills mismatch. And sometimes perhaps it could just be skills shortage. Finding those jobs that require those highly trained individuals does take a long time to fill the gap. My husband's an IT specialist in the telecom sector. He was recently approached for a role. It took them 10 months to appoint him. But, they're very thorough recruitment process. So perhaps sometimes it's not even as simple as the skills mismatch. It's internal company processes that can cause delays. So I agree. I think what we're also seeing is there is this vulnerability in the job market. I think people are feeling a little bit insecure after the global financial crisis. In South Africa, in the first 10 years post-apartheid, we had a very interesting phenomena of jobless growth. So our economy expanded rapidly in the first decade after apartheid, but the job numbers didn't grow. So it also shows that businesses can grow, but you don't need additional people. So, does that speak to a skills mismatch? I can't say for sure. But we were able to grow using the headcount that we had in companies. So again, it becomes very simplistic to just say it was a skills mismatch and we didn't employ. I think what we're also seeing is there is only so much absorption big business can make. So in my day job, I represent Business Leadership South Africa, which has a membership of the 100 big businesses in the country, multinationals, and those listed on the stock exchange, ranging everywhere from engineering to financial services to consulting. Those businesses are not expanding. It doesn't mean they're not making a profit. So the absorption capacity, particularly of big business, is limited. I think we need to start looking at our small and medium sectors. If that's where we want to address this issue of skills shortage, it's probably felt most at a medium-sized company level, because many of these companies don't have the skills or the administration to train. So they're expecting mostly big business to do the training and then poach. But also our small and micro enterprise sector cannot train. So how do we address those sectors who probably have the greatest absorption capacity and can take in the skills that we are creating? I think the other issue that we need to look at is, does a skill equal an occupation? So we put people into universities, we put people into colleges, they come out with some form of qualification. Does that equal an occupation? So again, how do we meet this issue of retention, recruitment, attraction, where sometimes job titles don't match qualification names? That's another issue I think we need to look at. Particularly in South Africa, what we're also seeing is this lack of international competitiveness. So we're falling rapidly on the global competitiveness index, and you're finding that we're not necessarily reskilling sufficiently. So I know we talk a lot about upskilling, but what about reskilling our current cohort so that they can then fit into those roles much better and adapt to whatever changes are coming down the line?
Thank you, Mani. And actually, with the already mentioning the retention measures and also other types of incentives, I go back now to you, Anna. What strikes me the most in this research is the fact that when 1 in 4 workers are actually operating at the level which are lower than their productive capacity. That actually says a lot about the whole over-education issue. And in fact, we have known for a long time already that skills utilization is a huge problem. So from the perspective of workers, of trade unions, what can be done to utilize available skills better? Because we have a lot of discussions about skills shortages, skills gaps, but we have an enormous pool of skills there which is underutilized. What can be done?
Well, I don't believe that somebody can be over-educated. I think education is still always good, a good thing. Now, if you look, for instance, at rankings, country rankings on innovative workplaces, Sweden ranks first. Why does Sweden rank first? Because you have there at the company level, but also at the national level, you have consultations. Again, I'm bringing this up again, but it's important. You have continuous established dialogue between the social partners who are updating the training needed at the firm levels, and therefore also promote organizational change as well. So the productivity that you just talked about, the levels of productivity also go up in that sense. And what is also important when you talk about retention and about over-educated workforce, it is not so much about precisely what they learned in terms of skills on paper, but it is more about at the workplace to look at task-specific skills, at process skills, and also at complex problem-solving skills, at all that, in order to then see how can these skills be encouraged with employees at the workplace. And this needs to be done in constant dialogue with them. And sort of what do you need? And precisely when you mentioned that there are not many surveys on what employees want. It's true, because you always see employer questionnaires, which is completely valid and relevant. We need to know what you need, but at the same time, it has to be the other way around. So we need to make use of household service as well. And for workers, it is also then important, no matter in which situation they find themselves, to also see an incentive to go into training again. And this has to do with wage premiums, and this has to do with recognition systems that need to be discussed and that need to be much more clear as to how can I have my new acquired skills recognized? What will be the benefit of it, of me moving along with, for instance, technological change, and especially since you asked about technological change, if we believe that there will be a transformation of tasks, then we need to look at the occupational changes that will take place and precisely adapt training systems in that way. And just one quick remark, because it was mentioned, and I'm coming from the trade union movement, so I need to address that. When I hear the example of Uber, of the gig economy, of the flexibilization of workplaces or of work contracts in the future, and this very much really also relates to skills mismatches. If you say that workers will now have to just work for different gigs, for different employers all the time and adapt, this is individualizing responsibility yet again. So they are left even more alone. So if you say we already face the problem of skills mismatches, how bad will it be if we accept such business models and such a vision of the future Because yes, workers might need to then move from jobs or have multiple jobs, but then there are multi-employer contracts. There are then, then you have to rely more on public education and training systems, which we just, not me, but we just spoke about as being too rigid and too slow in their way of adapting. So it's then this to me is contradictory in a sense. So my point, I guess, is first of all, we cannot accept such individualization of responsibilities, and we need to strive for quality jobs. And an Uber driver in South Africa might be lifted off from youth unemployment, which is important. But if you then think one step ahead and there will be autonomous cars soon, what will you do in 10 years? And will Uber provide him with a training scheme? No. And probably not have discussions with trade union either. I know this doesn't concern real social dialogue in countries, but still it's an important point to make.
Thank you, Anna. So better quality jobs and skills recognition basically are the two lines of policy making which we need to look into. Sunita, let's revisit again the governmental perspective. In your work as a think tank, you're providing some analysis for informed decision making in relation to planning, including skills planning. What are the major challenges, including those ones in relation to labor market information? I know it's a big issue in India.
See, as I earlier said, the major challenge in the country is that we have a huge informal sector, and it's very difficult to collect the data on the kind of skills that they require and where are they meeting their demand from. It's very, very difficult to get the data. But then what we have done is in the national skill development policies, many state skill development missions have been opened up, and these state skill development missions are collecting the data. And based on their local demand, and they're trying to make their policies. Their programs also. This is how we are trying to address the challenge at the local level that we are just trying to do it. From my think tank perspective, from my institution perspective, we do collect the data, then we analyze. And we tell the ministry, the central ministry of the government of India, that this is what they're supposed to do, and this is how the intervention can be. I'll just give an example. For example, like the kind of public-private partnership that we are doing currently, it's mostly the delivery-based. It's a public resources which are being used by the private sector to make the delivery of the training program. So think tank like Niti Aayog is trying to tell them that private sector can be utilized in much better ways. Private sector can be also utilized in terms of making the curriculum changes or maybe providing your workspaces. Therefore, we are emphasizing upon that apprenticeship training should be the key for the skill development in the country. Because apprenticeship training will provide not only the industry, the ready available manpower, because the industry can then mold the labor force according to their own work processes. And when they move out of the industry, they will actually they know what the industry knows. Secondly, what we are doing in the informal sector, we are also focusing on what we call the recognition of prior learning. There are people who are having these skills, but just because they do not have the certified skills, we are not able to tell them that they are the skilled worker. So recognition of prior learning is a major program that we are running in the country, and through which, in a cluster-based approach, otherwise also we are trying to identify the people who have the skill set so that we certify them according to the set standard of the National Skill Qualification Framework. Once they are certified, then they're available to work in the market, and through this, we are trying to address. Finally, we are also having programs, which are addressing the requirement not only of in general, but also specific groups, be it women, be it the disabled persons, or people who are migrating from different states. The people who are migrating from the rural to the urban center, the effort is to have the migration support centers, because India is looking at huge urbanization. What Manish was talking in the morning session, the cities are really growing, and in 10 years' time, we are going to be 50% urbanized. Now, how do I meet the requirement? Unless and until I have a database. So to meet that, we are having a migration support center, and these migration support center are telling these people who are migrating from the rural to the urban areas where exactly, and they're trying to map their skill requirement also, and then giving the finishing touch and small training programs to them so that they can meet the requirement of the places where they are moving on.
Thank you very much, Sunita. I think I still would like to collect at least a couple of questions from the floor. So if someone has a question, please raise your hand. And there will be a volunteer bringing you a microphone. You have to stand up and introduce yourself, the name and the affiliation. Aryan.
Hi, my name is Arjen Dij. I work for the European Training Foundation. I just would like to ask the research that you're referring to. And these countries, they're developing countries, middle-income countries. You refer more to research that has been done in industrialized countries. To what extent can you translate the findings about the skill mismatch, which is mainly from industrialized countries, really to the situation in the developing countries, where there are much more informal employment, much more different forms of employment, maybe different types of skill sets are needed?
Let me collect maybe some more. Other questions? There is one over there. And I think that's it. We will not take more.
Thank you. My name is Gideon Badagawa. I am from Uganda. I work with the Private Sector Foundation. Now, since this morning, we have been talking about what skills employers need. And to me, it's not the employers that should actually be creating the jobs that we are looking for. It should be the people that are looking for these jobs to apply themselves, to make sure that they have the skills that it takes to sit in these jobs. And since this morning, we have actually concentrated more on the practical skills, mainly the hands-on. I have not heard a lot about application through emotive training, like using your head, using your heart. It has been more to use our hands. And what employers are looking for, beyond the hard skills, are actually the soft skills. They are more important, that this person that you are engaging is able to be innovative, to think aloud. They are looking at cognition. They are looking at creativity for enhanced productivity. Yeah. So it's not enough to go to school, to go to a TVET institution and get as much skill, practical skills, but it's more about how you are going to translate this to apply it in the real world, at the workplace. So I thought maybe the panel could help us engage more on that and see how is it that we can cultivate the soft skills to be able to help the employers get the people that they need.
Okay, your question is clear. Thank you very much. So I'll ask Seamus to address the first question.
Very good question. The answer is they don't relate. Well, the two research programs were actually ended up with formal models that tried to explain differences in rates of cross-country differences in rates of overeducation. The first study was obviously based on European data, and the second study on low and middle income data. So what we did find, there was commonalities. There was commonalities in terms of overeducation and undereducation were present in both developed and developing labour markets. The trends were relatively constant, and when we saw overeducation, it was associated with high wage penalties, which indicates underutilisation. However, the drivers were very different. Within the developed labour markets, things like female participation, which related to labour market protection legislation, GDP growth, levels of labour market flexibility, they explained the variations in cross-country overeducation rates within developed economies. When in developing economies, it's a completely different story. Over and undereducation occur at much lower levels. So undereducated people are actually have low levels of education, much relative to the developed economy situation, which tells us they are in very low quality jobs. And overeducation, again, tends to be at a lower level so where overeducation in developed economies tends to be a graduate phenomenon, in developing economies it tends to be a post-secondary education phenomenon. So they are very different. The policy responses are very different. For developing economies, It is around raising the quality of jobs, improving and expanding informal employment, and raising educational standards. For high-income countries, it's more around the institutional arguments.
Thank you very much, Seamus. I think that was also a very good summary of the policy discussion we had here. So, Mani, could you address the second question, please?
Certainly, and thank you to my African counterpart for raising that. I think it's a critical issue, and we have been remiss in not highlighting it. I think in the South African experience, we're seeing that those attitudinal skills, and in fact, we don't want to call them soft skills because we tend to place lower emphasis when we talk about soft skills. They're actually critical, business critical skills. And what we're doing in many of our programs, particularly those that are centering around internships and apprentices, we're including that component as a prerequisite to the training. So some of the programs actually put the learners or the incumbent candidates into a 3-month orientation program to understand the world of work, not from a technical perspective, but what are your roles and responsibilities as an employee? We're dealing in South Africa with youth who have multi-generational unemployment in their families. So they actually don't have a role model who's been to work consistently. So things like coming to work on time, how to budget your stipend when you get paid at the end of the month, how to dress appropriately for work. When you're apportioned annual sick leave, it doesn't mean you use it in the first few months of the year. It is an annual sick leave allocation. So how do you manage those things? How do you take instruction? It's a very interesting phenomena, and we find that more and more employers say that the ability to understand instruction is lacking in many of our young people, and we're not able to directly correlate whether it's the quality of the school-leaving education, that their literacy and numeracy is at such a basic level that when they come into the workplace, they battle with business English. So communication skills, how to write business English, how to write an email. The kids come into the workplace and tend to talk in text speak. They're so used to using forms of social media, but it's not a form of communication that we who've been in the workplace for a long time appreciate. So perhaps we must change our attitudes as the older ones in the workforce. But using the letter U instead of Y-O-U, for example, it's little things, but these are not things that they're taught in school or at college or at university. So definitely those business critical skills and those social skills are so important. And I think the other challenge that we have is many of our older employers complain about the attitude or this attitude of expectation. And I think it's perhaps unfair to always put it on the young person, because perhaps we also need to shift our attitudes in how we communicate with the new generation coming into the workplace.
Thank you, Mani. So just to sum up, more and better jobs on the one hand, and more and better education and skills on the other hand. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I would suggest if there are more questions, we can take them during the coffee break. I would like to thank from my side the panel speakers and invite my colleague Paul to bring some conclusions.
To give a bit of a round of applause for the panellists, please. Thanks for their contributions. I guess from my perspective, what I'd just like to do in these last couple of minutes is to highlight, I think, what are some important takeaway messages. We have a little bit of time on the clock, but I think this question about recognising that there is quite a bit of noise around the issue of skills mismatch. And so often, the term is thrown around about without there really being enough clarity and enough specificity about, what you're really talking about. Is it skills gaps? Is it skills shortages? Is it over-education? Is it horizontal mismatch in that sense? And so that raises that question of data. Do we have enough data? Is enough effort going into actually collecting data that allows you to really understand what sort of mismatch is an issue, if it is an issue? And then are the policies really connected to that particular type of mismatch? And even I think with some of the data that does exist, I think we need to be cautious that it doesn't necessarily represent the issue that's there. And I think that study from CEDEFOP, where, you know, the figure of initially 47% of employers experiencing recruitment vacancies, when you pull that down to what was actually driven by skills, you know, you got to 10 to 12%. So being able to get a clear picture and tailoring the policy responses are really important there. And I think that question of policy then brings us to the issue about, you know, what is this balance between supply side interventions and demand side interventions. And I think, you know, we're all familiar with the orthodoxy that surrounds supply side reform in terms of, you know, qualification frameworks, bringing industry into the picture, work-based learning, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not to say that they're not important, but I think, you know, the research on skills mismatch and the reality of what we know about skills mismatch and the fact that overeducation and overskilling is as much, if not larger, problem than skill gaps and skill shortages, right? So the oversupply side, if you like, is more of a challenge than the immediate experience of employers in meeting skill needs. Really does put the focus on demand side policies. What's actually happening in workplaces? How are policies geared towards improving the utilisation of skills, understanding what skills exist in a workplace, and connecting those skills with market strategies, with product strategies of enterprises. So the link between skills and enterprise development, the link between skills and HR practices, that I think is the part of the policy space which is a bit underdone at the moment. There's a lot of attention on supply side. Everyone's looking at the supply side. There's less attention to that demand side and what's going on in workplaces. So with that, I guess, you know, draws to a close this session sponsored by the ILO. Hope you've got something out of it. And feel free to get in touch if you want more information from the research that's been presented here today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was an excellent panel with some interesting insights from India, from France, from South Africa, and of course from Seamus as well. And I think some of the points just to bear in mind and to keep them running through the thinking, in addition to what Paul has said, there was some very interesting, Manny from South Africa pointing out that there is that real danger, and some of you may have faced it in the workplace, that you train someone intensively for 2 years, and by the time they're trained, the job or the skill no longer exists. And we do know that that is a real problem. And yet, another note of caution, breaking down from Seamus to say that be careful, because there are still many jobs where there doesn't need to be a high level of literacy, a high level of numeracy, and a high level of IT. That there are pockets, and must prepare for the pockets, but there's a vast range of other jobs which still will be the skills that need to be developed. And that was very, very important, Sunita, for you to mention, both in countries like India, also across Africa, huge informal sector where you don't have the data that you do in more developed economies. And the certification, excellent initiative to try to certify people who have the skills but just don't have the certificate. And then I'm glad you picked up on the suggestion of this morning that every workplace should also be a training place, which may be the best way to keep abreast of what is changing and what is not. And thank you very much again, Seamus, for bringing us back always to the evidence, the evidence, the evidence.